So I'm really excited for this panel. We have some amazing organizers and writers. So Micah Uetricht is editor of Jacobin, as well as author of Bigger Than Bernie. Eric Blanc is author of Red State Revolt. Jane Slaughter is former editor of Labor Notes, as well as a DSA member. Robbie Nelson is a member of NYC VSA and a public high school teacher. Barry Eidlin is a sociology professor at McGill University, and author of Labor in the Class Idea. And Bianca Cunningham is former co-chair of NYC VSA and a staff organizer at Labor Notes, as well as co-founder of the Afro-Socialist DSA caucus. So this is going to be a really awesome panel. Stop screen sharing. So our first question is, which I'll direct to Eric, is how would you define what socialism means to you?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, it's great to see everybody. I'm glad you all are organizing this and the tuition strike. So solidarity. Socialism, I think the simplest way to answer it is that socialism means the creation of like a real economic and political democracy. The myth that we're taught growing up in this country is that we live in the beacon of democracy that the whole world, looks to. I think now actually that's probably even that. I don't know if anybody actually believes it now after Trump and all of the everything. But even before that, it wasn't close to being true. Not only because the U.S. political regime is so anti-democratic, even compared to like other capitalist democracies, like electoral college, Supreme Court, but just for the more basic reason that any capitalist democracy we have is really stunted because of the economic dictatorship of big business. And that's really what socialists want to end. Because when you go to work, unless you have a really strong union, and sometimes even when you do, you're basically giving up your rights. You don't have any say over what your work life looks like. And just generally working class people in this country and in other capitalist countries, we don't have a say over how resources are distributed, not in any direct way. So we don't get to choose if Amazon pays a living wage. We don't get to choose whether Instacart, which just fired the union members that wanted to unionize, whether they're allowed to do that. So really what socialism would be is to take that dictatorship, that rule of a small minority of billionaires out, take it out, and put resources and that we need to survive under democratic control. And that would in turn allow us to have a real political democracy, because as long as you have such a small minority of people with so much wealth, they can distort the political process. And I imagine most people on this call understand how that works, through lobbying and just threats of capital strikes. It's very hard to have real substantive democracy without economic democracy. That's what socialism is for. And then socialism as a movement, really briefly, and I think that's what we're going to be talking about, is I think the self-emancipation of workers. So I think what distinguishes socialists from maybe other progressives, that we really look to the organized working class as the central agent of radical and progressive change.
Go ahead, Robbie.
Yeah, so hey everyone, Robbie, thanks again to Emmaline, Willem, and everyone else who organized this and solidarity with this struggle. Yeah, I mean, I won't, I think Eric, I really agree with everything Eric said, and I'll just sort of maybe try to reframe it a little bit, right? So socialism is both a goal, right? A type of society that we are trying to move towards, and it's the movement that seeks to bring that society about, right? So a socialist society, like Eric said, right? It's a society that features democratic governance of society, of the state, of the workplace, and of civil society institutions led by the working class majority. But even more deeply than that, right? Socialism is an analysis of where our problems come from as a society, what are the primary obstacles to overcoming them, and then a sense of what forces we can actually marshal, we can actually bring to bear to overcome some of these obstacles. So, basically any problem that our society has, right? You can sort of chalk up to I'll rewind here for a second, right? Most of the solutions to the problems in our society require the redistribution of money and power. And what socialists say is that the reason that society is like that is because people actually benefit from the social situation. A liberal explanation often talks about the problems of our society as being either accidents, right, not made of bad will or of misunderstandings, whereas socialists understand that the inequalities of our society aren't accidents or misunderstanding. They're the outcome of a social system and a system of production that puts profit and privately held property in the hands of a few people. And the reason that socialists look to the organized working class as the agent of change is because of an analysis of where profit comes from. Right? Profit comes from workers. Workers produce the value that capitalists, the owners of those companies, of those banks, of those firms, skim off the top of our surplus labor. And so because capitalists depend on workers to produce their to produce their value through labor, it means that workers have a lot of capacity to stop the flow of profits. And just as you guys are seeing in this tuition strike, right? People in power don't do things that are good for the people in their institutions because they're nice people. They do so because we have to raise the cost of their intransigence, right? We basically have to say, it's going to cost you if you're trying to screw us over. We're going to go on strike. We're going to stop the flow of profits. We're going to stop business as usual until you give us what we want. So I think that's the main difference between a progressive liberal versus a socialist understanding of where problems come from, the extent to which they're sort of accidents or misunderstandings, and how we can bring power to bear on solving some of these problems.
Great, awesome. That was a great response. So the next question I have is how and why did you become involved in socialist organizing? And I'm gonna direct that to Bianca.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. So I became involved in socialist organizing, recently, actually. So a combination of factors. First and foremost, I was working a retail job for Verizon Wireless. We were dealing with all of the isms, the racism, the classism, just feeling oppressed as retail workers, like so many other service workers around the country. And looking at the differences and people who had union representation. I'm from Brooklyn, New York. So looking at people who had union representation, people that we'd see go on strike and fight for improvements, and that they seem to have like somewhat of like a middle class, like comfortable life. And comparing that with our own plights as workers, most of us were in our 20s and 30s, still living with our parents around Brooklyn, unable to afford to really move out and like gain any real financial independence. And when it did seem, we worked off a commission, when it did seem that we could gain some independence, it was always our boss's job, it was always the company's job to knock us down a peg and take away what we'd worked for, right? And so they dangle things in our faces, threaten to take them away. And we just really felt like our livelihoods were at the whim of our employer. And so we decided to fight back. We decided that we wanted to join the union. And so we, filed for a union election and took on that fight. Throughout that fight, I remember thinking like we were the first Verizon Wireless workers in the country to be seeking a union. And there's this huge employer. And we were wondering, like, why isn't media paying attention? Like, why don't people think this is a big deal? We're going through hell at work. They're flying in the CEO of the company. They're flying the CFO out. They're taking us in the basement and doing one-on-ones and captive audience meetings. And we were like, this is a story, right? But only we didn't realize that it wasn't a story because like capitalism and like owns the media, right? And like, they don't want that story to get out. But who were supportive, who was telling our story, who were the people who were amplifying our fight happened to be socialists, happened to be folks like at Labor Notes where I work, where they were like, tell us your story in your own words. This is really exciting, and like really like supporting us in a lot of ways. It was Micah Uetricht with the and others at Jacobin doing Jacobin reading groups and talking about strikes historically and teaching us that we were part of this long history, right? And this was a socialist community that came together to rally around workers. And so that really opened my eyes to see like, wow, these people, like we share a struggle, we share an analysis about, the struggle. And this really feels like a family that I could fight with. And so that's how I came to socialist organizing, that and Papa Bernie the first time. But I think it's so important, and I'm so lucky that that was rooted in class struggle for me. And not to say I didn't, experience other isms, like I said, there was racism and all of that work together in that system. But that is what gave me a political home to say I can fight back and we can actually win against these things.
Well, like Bianca, I also came to socialism pretty recently. I was radicalized during the Vietnam War. That's a joke. While I was in college. Actually, Bianca, I like your way of getting radicalized through class struggle better than my way, but it was a way that happened to many, many, many people in the 60s. So we had Vietnam, campuses are burning. The more I learned, I could see how the dots were connected, and I wanted to be the most radical that I could be. And as far as I could tell, socialism was about the most radical thing there was. So I was in various Maoist study groups. And then I met some socialists who actually had a fairly worked out plan for how we would get from where we were to socialism. It involved working in unions, which I think we're going to talk about later. And it made a lot of sense to me. So I joined this group, the International Socialists, in 1974 and moved to Detroit to become an auto worker. Well, as you guys know, that well worked out plan did not work out. We do not have socialism today. But I happen to think that some of the elements of it are still valid today, and we can talk about why. But in any case, we do need a plan. We can't just be all doing, our individual little things and having community gardens. And I will say that DSA is a big part of that plan.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks again. It's great to be on such a panel. And this is Wallace, by the way. He's my research assistant. But anyway, so we are, I'm in a bit of a weird situation. So I think it's an interesting mix here, because Bianca sort of represents sort of like a common experience for a lot of people these days who are fairly new to socialism and who have had this experience of the Bernie campaign over the past 5 years and this sort of resurgent movement that really hasn't existed for 50 years or more. And Jane is sort of on the tail end, I guess, of that previous movement, right? The New Left, right? Where there were these large movements that were radicalizing people. And I came of age in between these periods. So I'm a real weirdo in that there are very few people my age who are socialists. And so I guess I'm an outlier, and I guess the way that happened for me was an outlier experience. I happened to be in high school. I spent some time in high school in France, and as often is the case in France, when you're in high school, your teachers go out on strike, and so I had the experience when I was like 14 years old of being, confronted with this mass of students sort of like marching from high school to high school, calling everyone out in the streets and like marching through the streets of Paris and facing down the riot cops and getting tear gassed. And so that sort of like exposed me. And then, obviously through that, getting exposed to all these new ideas and talking to people. And then, and then that sort of lit the spark, if you will. And then when I was in college later on, I got involved in helping the campus workers organizing, and that was another sort of, I wasn't directly experiencing what the campus workers were experiencing, but I was certainly involved in sort of getting an inside view of that, and so that sort of ultimately convinced me after graduating to go work in the labor movement as an organizer, and ended up with a group called Teamsters for a Democratic Union. Actually, I started off interning at Labor Notes. That I think I need to mention that for gain. And that sort of obviously exposed me to this idea of the importance of the working class and that sort of rank and file organizing that has really informed my sort of my socialism, if you will, ever since. So that's sort of the capsule summary.
Okay, awesome. So many varied and great experiences on this call. So my next question is, what role does student organizing play in the struggle for socialism? And I'm going to hand it over to Micah for that.
Great. I first wanted to say thank you. It's an honor to be here on a list, an agenda full of speakers that is totally stacked with some of the best people on the American left. I'm just honored to be included on it. And I'm also very glad to be here with all of you who are waging this extremely important fight. And your fight has multiple angles to it, but I have a direct personal interest as somebody with $30,000 worth of student debt that I would like to disappear. And so I know that we're not going to get rid of that debt by, me publishing 50 articles in Jacobin about it alone. It's going to take people like you, students like you all, engaging in the kind of fight that you are currently engaged in order for us to win that kind of relief. So I'm definitely rooting for you for multiple reasons. So I came to radical politics through the student organizing. When I was in undergrad, I went to two different colleges, one called Aquinas College in Western Michigan and another Loyola University in Chicago. And in college, I had my eyes open to a million things. I got involved in anti-racist struggles on my campus in response to incidents of racism on campus, got involved in Latin America and solidarity stuff and part of the fight against the School of the Americas, which was very big at the two Catholic colleges that I went to. I became involved in the labor movement for the first time through United Students Against Sweatshops. And that set me on the course that the rest of my life has taken in the labor movement and in the socialist movement. And I would never want to downplay any of that because it was crucial to me. It's crucial to some of the other people on this panel. It's crucial to huge numbers of people around the world. And students obviously can play a really important role both in fights like the one you all are waging right now. I mean, forgiveness of, moving towards free college tuition for everybody and full forgiveness of all student loan debt is a really critical working class demand. That's essential. And obviously it's going to be students who are the ones who are at the forefront of that fight. And then of course there are many examples of students being at the, playing key roles in whatever the movements of the day are, whether it's students in the 60s being on the front lines of the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement. So obviously students have a really key role to play in all kinds of struggles that we're waging to win this better world that we all know is possible. But it's also essential to sort of to not take your to take your activism off the campus, basically, to understand that as important as the fights that you are waging are now. I mean, what's most important about what you're doing, I think, is getting a sense of your own power as an actor in the world. Learning about how the world works, how the problems that you face as a student are interconnected with all of these other problems that we have in society, and really dedicating yourself long-term to this struggle for this better world that will go, for a much longer amount of time than you are spending at Columbia or any other educational institution for your life. I mean, what happened with me was, I guess, the best case scenario, and that I sort of got a taste of the world and what the problems were, and I learned how to do things like get petition signatures and deliver a demand letter to my university administration. And I did a hunger strike at one point in our administration building over a decade ago. And I took all of that and then have like learned, used those as lessons to try to continue that fight for the rest of my life. And so that has to be an essential part of how I think you view your student activism. It's not just that you are trying to wage this very, very important fight at your own campus, at your own university, but that you dedicate yourself to continuing these kinds of fights, these kind of working class fights, long past your graduation date.
Yeah, so I'll just add something quick. The first is, so I agree with Micah, but I kind of want to give the other side of the coin there, because my impression is that a lot of times, because students, particularly maybe at a university like Columbia, are often relatively privileged compared to the rest of the country as a whole, there can be a tendency to like not want to take action actually sometimes because of like a sense of privilege. And to me, it's actually the opposite, is that students, across the board have a structural position which generally gives them a little bit more time, not always, obviously, depending on what your background is, but it's precisely because students are somehow a little bit more freed up generally from the constraints of class society. Then that actually is an opening that we need to seize, and that you all should seize, and that can provide an inspiration for other folks to fight back. And there's just so many examples of that throughout history. So I think it's true that, in the long term, it's going to be, the organized working class that has power. But like just at this moment, it's so amazing what you're doing as far as like fighting around tuition locally. But, just think about the role that students could play right now in setting a precedent for people across the country to fight, to demand that the Biden administration fulfill, the promises or the potential that it's sort of indicated, right? And imagine if there were student strikes and occupations across the country, that would have an effect beyond just the campuses. So I just, I would consider the role of like students as catalyzers, even if you're not like the big battalions of the working class. It doesn't mean that you can't have a big political role at this moment and in general.
Yeah, and I just wanted to build on what Eric and Micah were saying to add that, historically, Coco, in that basic, sorry, my daughter's, anyway, okay. So basically that the student movements have historic, so I'm a historical sociologist, so I study movements historically, and historically speaking, students have played this central role in popular struggles, right? There's been a lot going on in Latin America now, but then, obviously the New Left of the 1960s, in France, the May 68. So students have played this central role. And so it's important to understand, and that's for those reasons that Eric was mentioning about the space that you have to think, to act, that broader society might not have as much of. And it's also important to recognize there that in the same way that in workers' struggles, this goes back to this privilege question, I think, that in the same way that in workers' struggles, it's often the more quote unquote privileged layer, like more workers who are deemed more skilled, who have a critical role as these catalyzers, for organizing, entire workforces. It is often students at these more privileged campuses that end up playing certain leadership roles. Now, some of it is because, it's a function of their privilege. I don't want to say that it's all good, but there is a good reason for it. And it's not something to beat yourself up about, right? In the same way that I think it's not at the same time that you need to be understanding that student movements are at their most powerful when they are able to move off campus and create those linkages with other social groups, particularly workers. It's not productive as student activists to sort of spend your time beating yourself up about your current position. You need to sort of view it for what it is and take advantage of the structural advantages it gives you.
All right, awesome. These are all such insightful responses. So the next question is, what role does labor organizing play in the struggle for socialism? And I'm gonna toss that to Jane first.
Okay, well, first, what Robbie said. Labor is going to play an absolutely central role because the working class is where the ruling class gets its profit from, and we have the structural position in society to be able to bring it to a halt, and also to learn how to run society on our own, because we've already been running it. The Working class is not necessarily the most oppressed part of society. There's been a tendency on the left to look for the most oppressed. It's not, at this point, the most radical or the most easy to radicalize, but it's a strategic question. The working class has got that structural place. So to me, if you're thinking about putting the working class at the center of your strategy, then it makes sense to talk about unions. Now, you can come up with reasons for why not unions. Unions are only 10% of the workforce right now. Don't many union leaders tend to be pretty conservative? Don't they sometimes only look out for the interests of their own members and not for the whole working class? Yes, all those things are true. But I'll go on to say, we have to have some way of figuring out how to close the gap between the socialist ideas that people were talking about earlier and the vast majority of the working class. Because right now, it's like two trains passing in the night. You know, the DSA has grown hugely in the last few years, but it's still pretty small, very small in comparison to the population. And it tends to be concentrated in just one part of the working class, the more highly educated part of the working class. So how are we going to deal with the fact that the vast majority of workers are not socialists? They're more friendly to socialism than they used to be, believe me, when I started out, but still there's this big gap. And related to that, how do we create the actual power to get rid of capitalism? So I could go on and on. I think I should try to cut this short so somebody else can contribute. But part of it is, well, it would be great if we had a huge militant, class-conscious movement of workers right now that was just always out in the streets, always fighting the employers. But that doesn't exist. It's there in little bits and pieces, but not enough. And so one of our jobs as socialists is to help create that movement. How do we do that? We can't do it by standing on the sidewalk and holding up our publication with a beautiful socialist program. Believe me, people have tried this. It does not work.
Some of us are still trying.
What we need to do is actually be in those struggles and helping to foment those struggles. We need to be working alongside the rest of the working class so that A, we can help them to organize, help them to do all the things that you need to do to make the labor stronger, and also to be there when people start wondering about socialism. They have somebody to ask. You know, it's their buddy that's been working alongside them all this time. Just say one more thing about unions and stop is that there's 13 million union members. This is not a number to sneeze at. And unions are the most racially integrated organizations in American life. Try to think of another one. They bring people together who would not otherwise have anything to do with each other at the heart of production, where they're forced to cooperate simply to get their daily work done. So unions, I'm arguing, are the place to find workers who are already at least somewhat organized and thus in a better position to begin the fight.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Jane said. Unions are a great place to start. I feel like when I think about the working class, I don't think about unions because I think the majority of working class, like Jane just said, are not in unions. And I think that also, like, oftentimes I think about what the project is to get people to think about themselves as working class, right? So that we can start to expand what that means and what people think of when we say that, like who could be a union member. I remember when I was a retail worker, you know, my manager was saying stuff to me like, it doesn't matter that you guys are fighting for a union. Unions weren't made for retail workers. That's for people who work in factories. That's for people who work public sector jobs. It will never work for you. And I think that, like, you know, we wanted to fight back against that, but also had our own doubts about, like, does this union structure work for if I'm a bartender, for instance, or, you know, if I work, you know, at a veterinary office, or, you know, like who is the union for, is, I feel like, a question that I'm glad that is being explored, that I'm glad that we're talking about different kinds of workers and being a part of the union, but also that they could join the union. I really love the Google example that came out recently. You know, I think that we should just like find more solidarity and find more things in common. You know, I was speaking on a panel a couple months ago to some WNBA players, and I was like, you all have a union too. Like, you all are depending on the capitalist power and like the ruling class to give you endorsement deals and like pay your salary. That we all depend on like our labor to have a wage. We're working class, right? And so finding those like threads in common more often, I think, will really be important. And you see unions taking this question on, unions like the CWA, and they're organizing gamers and others. CWA is also like really involved in the LA stripper strike and trying to figure out a way to get these folks a union. I think that kind of union is like, that kind of organizing is really exciting to me because it's pushing the limits of what we know. And I think it's incumbent upon socialists to like provide that momentum, right? Because I think that a lot of times in these unions, like Jane says, you know, they are racially integrated, but they're a bit conservative. You know, sometimes they need a little kick. And I feel like the socialists, we're the kick, right? We're the ones that make it, you know, be so. We're the ones, you know, where they lack the will, we have the action and the analysis. And so it's on us to work together to push and make sure that these kinds of institutions are fighting for everyone, and that we can redefine what it means, right? And be imaginative in our organizing. So I think they go hand in hand.
Hey, I'm just gonna build on what Jane and Bianca have said. You know, I'm a professor for better or for worse, and so I might delve into a bit of the theory behind this. So basically, the key thing to understand about labor and the struggle for socialism is that, and going back to what Robbie was saying about the difference between a sort of socialist perspective and a sort of progressive liberal perspective, is that it is based in a materialist theory of how change happens and how people develop consciousness or understanding of the world around them, right? And I think that and you know, it's very easy, you know, because again, as students, you know, and as academics, you know, it's important to understand that we are kind of outliers, and that we spend our lives sort of like discussing these big ideas and like trying to convince each other. But for the most part, that's not how the world works, in the sense that most people don't make sense of their lives through debating it out with other people. They make sense of it by their lived experience. And social change doesn't happen by sort of convincing people one after the other that this is sort of this is the right idea and you should believe what I believe. And then people say, oh yeah, that's great. Okay, now we're all gonna believe this new idea together. We need organization, and we need organization in particular parts of society amongst people who are most likely, whose struggles are most likely to bring about the change that we want, right? And so that's why we focus on labor, because that is the place where we can actually organize workers into a collective force. And when workers are in struggle, that is actually when they become more open to seeing new possibilities, new ideas, and sort of seeing that a different world is possible. It's not through being convinced of it, through talking it through, it's through action. And so that's really, so it's a strategic vision for why we focus on it, not because we want to help the most oppressed people, not because we want to, we want to go around convincing people of this idea. It's because this is the strategic vision for getting to where we want to go.
So people have been talking about big picture questions here that are obviously the most important answers to this question. I just wanted to contribute my own personal answer to this question, which is that currently I am an editor at Jacobin. I write and edit other people's writing about socialism all day. I wrote a book about the labor union. I'm like a full-time socialist intellectual. But the thing that I did when I graduated college, the first thing I did was I worked as a retail worker at O'Hare Airport and organized a union with 200 of my coworkers, and then worked for 2 years as an organizer trying to organize car wash workers. And I eventually learned that I was not particularly good at that, and I should not be an organizer, and no one should entrust union organizing in my hands because I'm actually not very good at it. But in doing so, it totally transformed my ideas about how social change happens. I mean, to be frank, in hindsight, I was pretty full of shit in how I thought. Like, I spent a lot of time reading books and crafting arguments well, and through actually being engaged in the day-to-day stuff of the labor movement and organizing a union with my coworkers, and then trying to organize a union with car wash workers, the magazine stuff is nice. It has its place, but like, that's not the way that you craft arguments to move people into actually changing the world is actually very different when you're like in a workplace, and it's based on other stuff. It's not based on how beautiful your prose is coming out of your lips as you're speaking to them. It's based on relationship building, trust building. And so, that experience in the labor movement was really central to me, just understanding how social change happens. And, as I said, has hopefully made me a little less full of shit as an editor as a result.
Yeah, and I'll just sort of wrap up this section and kind of, kind of make a pitch, right? So, it's so important that the labor movement and the socialist movement have full-time organizers like Bianca, like Jane, right? Like Micah, people who work full-time in the socialist and labor movements. We need organizations, and it's not a volunteer operation. If you're serious about changing the world, it's not something you do after you clock out of work. Not everyone can do it after they clock out of work. However, there has been a tendency for socialists to concentrate themselves in staff union jobs, and not enough socialists who are actually out there among the rank and file, right? Like working with your coworkers who you want to bring about to who you want to convince them to vote for Bernie. You want to convince them to go on strike. You want to convince them to get in the car and go up to Hunts Point to support the Teamster strike, right? You want to move them to any kind of political action. It's actually so much easier to do that if, like Jane said, you've been working next to them for 5 years, for 10 years, right? And so it's really important, and this is part of something that Barry and others have written about, and that Jane has also written a lot about, called the rank and file strategy, right? And it means a lot of things, but one key and one of the things it can mean is, like I said, going to support the picket line at Hunts Point right now. But another really important thing that it means is socialists intentionally getting jobs in industries, either with an eye towards organizing union, or more likely into an industry that's already heavily unionized, right? And we see important avenues for the growth of the left. So, for example, I'm a teacher in the New York City public schools, right? There's a lot of problems with that union, the UFT, right? And, I can sit here and talk to you all day about it. But right, being a public school teacher at a working class high school in Brooklyn means that I am in daily contact with hundreds and thousands of my coworkers, of my students and their families who live, work, and have our, worship, socialize, and have our community here in Brooklyn. And it's important for socialists to become rooted both in the neighborhoods and in the workplaces of people, who we want to become comrades with, right? We want, like someone said before, working class self-emancipation is at the heart of socialism. And if socialists can't, socialists need to be alongside workers where production happens and where community happens. And so, just to pitch to all of you, right? Like, if you're going to graduate college and you're thinking about, what kind of job do you want to get, I would highly recommend that people consider taking jobs in workplaces that have union representation, that are large or strategically important employers. So, Teamsters, teachers, nurses, social workers, right? City workers. If you want to look, and again, to be slightly cynical about it, right? if you want to stay and live in New York City and you're not from here, being a teacher or a nurse or a city worker is a pretty good way of actually being able to do it, right, in a sustainable fashion. And it's going to be a way that's going to put you into contact with the types of working class people that we need if we want a real working class movement for self-emancipation.
Absolutely. That is a great pitch for rank and file strategy. And I, decided to also become a teacher because of being involved in YDSA, and because I think labor organizing is how we're going to win socialism. So we have an audience question. Someone asked, so is there a point to the intellectual side of the left? Do we need to think about things like Marxism or ideas? And they say, I guess it's sort of an obvious question, since I don't think anyone would say ideas don't matter at all, but I'm wondering how it does or doesn't matter. And I'm going to give that to Barry to answer.
Yes, give it to the sociology professor, of course. So this is a really crucial question, particularly in the US, and I would say Canadian left, it's also true, that there's a tendency on the left to devalue ideas. And it's possible to read the comments that we've been talking about today, and the sort of importance of like engaging in active struggle and organizing in the working class as a sort of reinforcement of that idea. But I would caution against that. In fact, I think that ideas are important, and intellectuals play a critical role. There's a division of labor in movements, and that's a good thing, right? They need to be tied together, right? So I think that this sort of like cut off intellectual that just is sort of off in their own ivory tower or whatever, that's one thing. But movements need intellectuals, and I think that there's a culture in US movements recently of, that I forget who it was who wrote that great piece, but there's something called activistism, right? Where the idea being that, the way to be an activist is just to like move from one action to another. And you're not really thinking about what your broader strategy is, where you're going. And with that, if that's what you end up doing, you end up not going, you're not getting anywhere. And it's important to recognize, just in terms of like the if we're thinking about the broader socialist movement and the people who have built this movement historically, like no one would accuse Rosa Luxemburg of being some sort of like cut off head in the clouds intellectual, and yet she had the time amidst organizing the Spartacus faction in Germany to write a several hundred-page book on the accumulation of capital, right? Which was not. You would look at that and say it's very highly theoretical. But yet it was deeply informed by the questions that came out of her activism, right? And so I think that that's an extreme example maybe, but this idea that intellectual work does not have a role or should be devalued in the movement and in favor of just more action is a real problem that we need to pay attention to.
All right, thanks so much for addressing that. So the next question that I had was, what role does electoral organizing play in the struggle for socialism? And I'm going to give that to Eric first.
Yeah, so this is a really good question. I'll just maybe preface it by saying, up until recently, if you were on the left in the United States, your answer to this would probably have been like, electoral organizing is not that important. For instance, when I was a student activist, and even when I was still like more of a labor activist, that was really common, which is understandable because politics in this country, as we experience it, through like the Democrats and the Republicans, is dominated by corporations, and it's just kind of shitty all around for the most part. But I think that it's pretty easy to prove that over the last 5 years, really since the Bernie campaign in 2015, 2016, we've seen how important electoral politics is to socialist organizing and why that is. And I think there's a couple of different reasons. If you want to sum it up, what electoral politics allows you to do is engage with the arena that the vast majority of people in this country see as like really the only avenue through which they can have some sort of like political intervention. That's not actually a good thing. We wanted that people to intervene at work and their community, but the reality is that for most people, elections is the one thing that they can do in their mind to change the political system. And so the problem is, if we don't engage where people are at in that avenue, what we do is we let our class enemies and the corporate puppets dominate that space. And that has just like horrible repercussions that we've seen over the last 80 years. And so what Bernie and AOC and on a local level, a lot of other candidates, like in New York City, we just, DSA just elected a clean slate of our candidates to Albany. What it shows you is that by intervening in elections, you can build class power and build class organization and win real important material gains in the lives of the multiracial working class. So, just to give some examples of that anecdotally, I don't know, for student activists today in Columbia, like presumably it's not that controversial to say you're socialist, but it's just, it's such a game change. People take it for granted now. They're like, oh yeah, Bernie's democratic socialist. If anything, it's cool to call yourself a communist now, right? Because it's a little bit like amongst some radicals. But the reality is Bernie created this huge space in the electoral arena that changed the ability for socialism to even be like a legitimate avenue in American political life. And so that's just like one concrete example of how consciousness can change. And as far as the growth of organization, we've seen Democratic Socialists of America grow massively, in large part because of the prominence of people like Bernie, AOC, the Squad, and others, right? And that's concretized then in the organizing we're able to do year-round, including in workplaces. And I would just say to maybe the end, the real crucial strategic tension for the socialist movement has always been, and it's not an easy one to resolve, is how do you combine electoral politics with organizing at the workplace and sort of in the streets? And the major limitation is if you go too far in one direction or the other, because you're not going to be able to win the things we need just in the streets or in the workplace. But you're also not going to be able to do that even if you elected Bernie president or if we had more socialist politicians. So the real kind of like central strategic thing that hopefully can tie a lot of what we've been talking together is how do you build power within the state to transform it and to win the gains we need, but combining that with building independent organization outside of it. And I think that it's going to be kind of up to a lot of us and a lot of you who are involved to work that out in practice, because the fact that we're not living under socialism yet kind of shows how hard it is to do that.
I think a lot of us on this call, some of us who have been socialists for a long time, had our ideas of what electoral politics can be in the United States totally transformed by the Bernie campaign. I mean, several of us come from traditions in the socialist left that rejected electoral politics almost entirely for many years, many decades. And Bernie came along and showed us that we were wrong about a lot of that. Not wrong about that there are these huge structural barriers to wielding electoral politics in an effective left way, not wrong to say that there are real limits to what we can accomplish through elections, that we do need this other grassroots movements piece, building working class power on the job, in the streets, etc. All of that, of course, and the limits, Lord knows, the limits of the Democratic Party, this horrible party that we're stuck with. Like, we can talk about all of that stuff, and that's definitely true. But the terrain of American politics has been completely reshaped over the last 5 years by the first Bernie Sanders campaign. And it has helped, it's part of the reason why we are having this panel right now and why people are getting together and talking about socialism in the context of this fight that they're leading on their campuses. I mean, the electoral politics has had these kind of knock-on effects all over the place. I mean, in workplace organizing, you read Eric's book. I mean, he can talk about the role that the Bernie campaign helped play in bringing together the folks who helped organize the West Virginia teacher strike that then spread across the country. I mean, there are tons of examples of this all over, and we're seeing how it's not a question of do we do elections or do we do some other stuff. Like, it is possible to run electoral campaigns and get people who are elected to office that then serve to strengthen and to energize these movements in the streets and at the workplace. And that's what we need to be doing. And so, I mean, just it's hard to overstate how much the terrain has shifted because of these electoral campaigns that nobody would have guessed. If you had asked any of us who are already radicalized 6 years ago if we thought that we would be in the situation we're in 2021, where we have a revitalized American socialist movement, where we have some, the labor movement's still really weak, but we have some really promising stuff happening. We've got left elected officials getting elected in key places around the country, and importantly, in places like New York, like playing a key role in putting substantial wins on the board for working class New Yorkers. I mean, like socialists like Julia Salazar played a key role in getting the recent spate of rent laws passed at the state level in New York. Not the sole role, not even maybe the majority role, but played a key role in making that happen. So we've seen that, and everyone on this call can emphasize to you, it's not just going to be through elections that we do all this stuff. We do need to be building, we need to be doing the rank and file strategy. We need to be doing a million other things. But elections are absolutely critical, and we're going to have to continue using them in a strategic way that can build the left and build the working class movement going forward.
Great, awesome. And then the next question that I had was, what is the relationship between the fight for socialism and the fight against racism and other forms of oppression? And I'm going to hand that to Bianca.
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to take this question. When people join DSA and they get political education, we often, if you take the training, we often talk about something called the problem tree, which has its roots, right? And the roots of the tree are patriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacy. And we acknowledge that all three of those things are working together to oppress a certain class of people, right? And so, like, I'll just talk about my own experience and why I think it's so important. Like, when I was organizing with my coworkers to join the union, we were like 98% Afro-Caribbean or, Black workers. We did have like one store that was Russian speaking in Bensonhurst, South Brooklyn, for those of you who are familiar, Brighton Beach, for those of you who are familiar. And, it's important to like that we talk about these things all together, not like Barry said, because we're like, not for the reasons like I agree with what Barry said earlier, but also because like this is the way that we experience oppression, and this is like these are the tools that the ruling class uses to oppress us. And so, for instance, when we wanted to unionize, one of the very first things the company did, was replace all of our white managers with Black managers, even up into our district manager, whose name was Mike, a white guy. They replaced him with another person, the same title, Mike, a Black guy, and we would make jokes about it and say, like, do they think we're like idiots? Like, why do they do that, right? They do that because that was an attempt to make us soft on the union, say, like, let's put people in there that look like you and that can talk to you and maybe carry a message, right? And so then you would feel like you don't really want to fight like your own people, right? So that's the first step they did. And that's using racism and division. The second thing that they did was they went to that one Russian speaking store where there was maybe 5 to 7 white workers and said, hey, you guys, you have it really good here. You get to speak your own language and have tea in the basement. It's kind of a slow store because it's just catered to Russian speaking customers. You really don't have anything in common with these other workers all around Brooklyn. They're lazy. They're just complaining. You guys shouldn't be involved. Many of the people in that store then got promoted, agreed to work with management, and got promoted to be assistant managers over us, to be snitches and report back to, the upper management. That store was the first one to close. After we won the union, they were the first ones to close. They were the first ones laid off, and many of the people that they had as being these assistant managers that chose to snitch on us were laid off as soon as we won. And so it's like they used them, right? And like they obviously they fell for that bait. And so we just have to like recognize the way that the ruling class uses these tricks to like distort and keep the activism and the momentum like stifled. And so that's why it's important that we talk about all these things. That's because we need people to see themselves in our movement. We need people to we need people to be prepared. It wasn't enough that the union said like, yes, you are workers fighting back and we're all workers together. They had to address like, yeah, that was really dumb that they did that. Why did they do that? Like, we have to answer these questions. And so it's not good enough to leave one or the other out. We have to talk about it as a totality, in my opinion.
All right, awesome. Yeah, go ahead, Barry.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. I really liked Bianca's comments on this, and I just want to sort of, in a broader context, sort of emphasize that, the fight for socialism has been an integral, the fight against racism has been integral to the fight for socialism for much of its history. I think that if you think about the third world liberation struggles of the middle of the last century, they were deeply informed by Marxism and socialists, and it wasn't just a sideshow. I think like their analysis of their anti-colonial oppression, of their colonial oppression, came out of their understanding of the fight for socialism. And in the same way, in the U.S., the Communist Party of the 1930s was the civil rights movement of that time period, and it wasn't it wasn't just because they happened to be communists. Their communist ideology, their communist politics informed, made them the leading fighters against racism and Jim Crow in the 1930s. And so I think that it's important to understand that these two struggles are integrally linked.
Very amazing. And then I have one last question. Which is, what advice would you give to young people just getting involved in the socialist movement? And I'll give that to Robbie.
Hi, everyone. I'll be brief. Thanks again for having us on this panel. And thanks to Emmaline and all. I'll just be really brief and concrete. Find something you want to get involved in and get involved in it. But I think that's obvious. I would say seek mentorship. Right? Socialists want to mentor you. I would like nothing more than a young socialist who came to me saying, I want to get more involved in the socialist movement. Do you have time to mentor me or give me advice? That is that's what older socialists want to hear. That's what younger socialists need. And it's what older socialists need too, right? So building relationships with people already active in the movement and actively seeking mentorship, I would say, is the number one thing to do. And it's something that I benefited from a lot, and something that I would love to, pass on to another generation of socialists. I feel old even saying that, Jesus Christ.
Jane, you're muted.
I will add to that, join DSA or join YDSA. There's no such thing as an individual socialist or even an online socialist. You have to be working with other people if you expect to get anything done. And then I would say strongly consider, after you graduate, getting a job where you can contribute to the class struggle, as people have talked about already. Most people think of politics as something they do on nights and weekends, but if you have a job, then you can be doing politics all day long. That may not appeal to everybody, but if it does appeal to you, and think about places where there already are socialists working. In DSA, people, mostly what I hear them talking about are teaching, healthcare, and logistics, especially UPS. But there are, of course, many other places where you might be able to help organize your coworkers. I also would add, it's easier if you change your major now. I know a lot of socialists who decided on this course after they graduated and they had to go back and take more classes. It can be done. So talk to members of your local YDSA chapter, because YDSA is strongly committed to helping you do this. They are going to create a pipeline where people can get jobs together so you won't be isolated, to help you decide where you want to go and help you figure out how to do it.
Well, one thing I was going to say was also get a job, but clearly you've heard that advice enough. So I'll just say lastly that, I am a socialist principally because I want to build a better world. And I think that socialism offers the analysis about how to get to that better world, the tools for how to do it, et cetera, et cetera. And that's as it should be. That should be the principal thing that keeps me in the socialist movement. But that is not the only reason that I stay a socialist and stay involved in the socialist movement. The experiences that I have had in the socialist movement are some of the most meaningful experiences I have ever had of any kind in my entire life. I do not regret a single moment, unless you count like fighting on Twitter sometime when I shouldn't have been engaging with people. I don't regret a single moment of the time I have spent in this movement. It has led me to, I mean, I have undertaken alongside my comrades astonishingly difficult tasks to remake this world that is one that is currently characterized by oppression and exploitation. We're rolling this giant boulder up a hill. It's extremely difficult. We drop the boulder sometimes and got to go back to the bottom of the hill. And I would not give up a moment of that. It has been a fantastic way to spend my life. It has introduced me to some of the most beautiful people I have ever met. I don't think it's an accident that it's tremendously wonderful people who are engaged in this this struggle, including some people who are on this panel right now. So I don't regret a second of it. It's been a fantastic way to live a life. And I would suggest to other people that you also live your life this way, because you'll get a lot of it. It's not easy. You don't get paid a lot of money. Sometimes it's annoying, but I would not change it for the world. And I would want you to have that same life of real of real meaning and of fulfillment in the same way that I have gotten from dedicating my life to the socialist movement.
All right, thank you all so much. This was such an inspiring panel, and I'm so excited to be organizing with you all.